Miranda Darrow here, talking to you again about writing fiction. Just for fun, I'm going to tackle a different fiction genre each month. We're starting with women's fiction, also known as book club fiction, and sometimes chick lit and other terrible names. Full disclosure, I write women's fiction, and I kind of hate the label. I attended the Women's Fiction Writers Association 10th Anniversary Conference in Chicago in September of 2023, and there was a whole plenary discussion about the genre label and what it should be instead. And there was no consensus for a better name or definition for the genre, even though everyone there knew it well, read extensively, wrote, and loved it. Personally, I'm an advocate of calling it book club fiction and leaving it at that. But book clubs read all sorts of novels, so it isn't perfect. For the RevPit online novel revision contest, we call it women's fiction / book club because women's fiction is the term of art right now of what agents, acquiring editors, and other publishing people would call it. There's no point in making up a new title that no one uses. It's just like Gretchen from Mean Girls trying to make fetch happen. It takes a consensus to change the language. I'm not sure how these things happen and how Riz, Skibbity, Sigma, and NoCap can become mainstream while we're still wrestling with a decent definition for this very popular genre of fiction. These questions exceed the scope of this conversation, but I'm happy to discuss them more in the comments. Let's get to it. What is women's fiction or book club fiction? The Women's Fiction Writers Association, or WFWA, defines it as layered story in which the plot is driven by the main character's emotional journey. Note the complete lack of gender in this definition. Let's say this with emphasis. Women's fiction doesn't need to be written by a woman. Examples people give for this are Wally Lamb, who had 2 Oprah Book Club books, and Nicholas Sparks of the "that's not really a romance" genre fame. It doesn't need to have a woman as the main character either. One example for this is The Rosie Project, which was also written by a dude, Graham Simsian, where the main character is a guy named Don. It doesn't need to be marketed primarily to women and read primarily by women, but almost all fiction is read primarily by women. Historically, more women have read women's fiction than men, but that's true of almost all genres of fiction. Goodreads analyzed the reviews of 50 different genres, both fiction and nonfiction, and men posted the majority of reviews for only 4 of the 50 genres, and they were philosophy, comics, politics, and graphic novels. That's it. Women readers posted the majority of all reviews for all other genres, including horror, sci-fi, action, thrillers, literary fiction, all of them. This data was from 2017 and did not include a specific breakout of reviews by non-binary Goodreads members. So I would be interested in seeing a more recent update of this data. But the point remains, the gendered title of this genre is a vestige of the past, a product of the patriarchy, but we do not yet have a great alternative. Long story short, it's character-driven fiction about a person undergoing an emotional journey, which usually involves a dynamic character growth arc. What are some of the common themes and tropes in women's fiction? Well, first there's family. We've got multiple generations, generational trauma, conflict between sisters, mothers and daughters going at it, relationships with grandparents, and significant others, of course. There's also the career work-life balance, mommy wars, battles between stay-at-home moms and career moms, the pressures to be perfect and having it all while leaving nothing for yourself, sandwich generation, battling the glass ceiling and other barriers to professional success. We also talk about community, women who don't fit in with their group, like Marie Semple's Where'd You Go, Bernadette, and women who are trying to fit in, like Kathleen West's suburban Minnesotan moms on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I love her stories. And women trying to make changes, like the startup wife. No, wait. I'm not giving my recommendations now because I have too many, and this is going to be long enough. I've got a list that I'm saving of women's fiction's recommendations that I'll record for next week content. So stay tuned for that. There's also historical stories, untold stories of women whose stories got ignored and now get a chance to shine. The later generations who were impacted by this history and how it impacts all of us today. Those who don't heed history lessons are destined to make its mistakes again. There's also speculative elements that are usually as a framework. Sci-fi and dystopian stories have always been reflections of our world. Octavia Butler wrote a time travel story about a Black woman traveling back into the time of the slavery era back in 1979. That's when Kindred was first published. So this isn't anything new. Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale was first published in 1985. The hallmark of women's fiction is dynamic character growth arcs. This trumps form and function and POV and all sorts of other writing conventions that usually signal certain genres. Speaking of POV, first person present is pretty common, but so is third person. I pulled a bunch of my women's fiction titles out of my bookshelves and sorted them by POV and found nearly an equal split between first person and third person. The first person was split between past tense and present tense verbs, but the third person were all past tense. You can put it in whatever POV you want. And speaking of you, Carolyn Kepnes's you is written in second person, from the perspective of Creepy Joe writing a journal or letters or something like that to Beck, his muse for book 1 and season 1 if you have Netflix. It's written like prescriptive nonfiction, like a how-to manual of Joe telling Beck what he thinks she should feel and how he's going to get her to do what he wants. It's definitely memorable. There's also some fun epistolary novels falling into women's fiction, which are always a treat if they're done well. Don't men read stories with character growth arcs? Isn't the definition of literary fiction that it's character-driven rather than plot-driven? Yes, on both counts. And it burns my toast that similar stories about family and a main character's emotional journey resulting in a character growth arc written by male authors with male protagonists are usually sold as contemporary, general, or even literary fiction. I've got a short list of books by dudes that would have been women's fiction if written by a woman. This includes A Man Called Ove by Frederick Bachman. He's got a more remote POV than most of the women's fiction I've read, but it definitely hits themes of family, community, and character growth. How about Shotgun Love Songs by Nicholas Butler? And pretty much anything written by Nicholas Butler, including Little Faith. This was the last book that I recommended to my mom that she read and we discussed before she passed. So I'll always remember Little Faith. She told me it made her cry, and I knew that it would. How about The Logger Queen of Minnesota by J. Ryan Straddle, and also The Great Kitchens of the Midwest, and Saturday Night at the Lakeside Supper Club? Let's face it, I'd argue that gender is the only difference between J. Ryan Straddle and Amy Reichert, who also writes about family and food in the Midwest. Reichert wrote The Coincidence of Coconut Cake, Luck, Love, and Lemon Pie, and like Straddle, also has a Midwest roots and set a book in a supper club, the Kindred Spirits Supper Club, set in Wisconsin Dells. Love that one. If you're not from the Midwest and don't know what a supper club is, first, I recommend you visit soon before it gets cold. Check it out, they're amazing. And second, if travel is out of the question, check out both of these books. Continue with my theme of books that dudes wrote that would be considered literary fiction because they were men, but could be women's fiction. Let's nominate Wintering by Peter Gay. His books are all about family, generational trauma, and living in community. Yes, I know, I'm primarily naming Midwest-based authors here, except for Bachman, who's Swedish, but living in Minnesota means being surrounded by Scandinavians, so he fits. Please offer me your suggestions of non-Midwest literary fiction authors whose works would be considered women's fiction if written by a woman. I've got a couple more to show that I do read outside of the Midwest just a bit, including A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles, The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride, and There There by Tommy Orange. Okay, enough for the books that aren't considered women's fiction. Let's talk more about women's fiction and the most common subcategories. This includes contemporary, historical, family saga, which usually have an element of contemporary and historical, often with multiple timelines. Romantic women's fiction with a central love story, but not necessarily a romance genre happy ever after ending. Traditional mysteries like whodunits and cozy mysteries, and also domestic suspense, which blew up a little over a decade ago with all the Gone Girl, Girl on a Train, Luckiest Girl in the World. All these girls were in these twisty domestic suspense dramas, often with interfamily suspicion. We don't know who to trust, lots of unreliable narrators in that crowd. And then there's speculative fiction, which includes a very recent spate of gothic haunted house types and stories with funky time loops and other paranormal elements in an otherwise contemporary Earth setting. Some of these would qualify as magical realism, others as curio fiction. I'm sure I'm missing some important subcategories of women's fiction, so feel free to email me at miranda@mirandadarrow.com or drop a note in the comments to let me know what I've missed. If your novel has elements of women's fiction plus another genre, think about which the focus is on more primarily, the character's emotional journey or the external plot, whether that's a mystery or a suspense or a romance. If you remove the growth arc, would your story be pretty much the same? If so, it's probably the other genre, as the growth arc and emotional journey should be an integral component of the story for women's fiction. As an editor who has worked on a ton of women's fiction, what are my recommendations for writers interested in writing in this genre? Like all genres, read current titles within the past few years to find out what styles and trends are popular now. Focus your story on your main character or a small group of main characters. It's fine to have multiple POV characters, but then they really all should have their own character growth arcs. For example, Barbara O'Neill's When We Believed in Mermaids is from the POVs of two sisters, and it starts with this incredible first line. My sister had been dead for nearly 15 years when I see her on the TV news. Okay, I need to know more. Both the sisters have a POV and a growth arc to explain this long absence and how it happened, and where they can go as a family after this discovery that she's not really dead after all. Ask yourself, who is your main character or small group of main characters? I especially recommend keeping the number of POV characters to 3 or less if you're a newer writer in this genre. What is your main character's GMC, their goal, motivation, and conflict? If you're not familiar with this concept, please look it up, GMC, goal, motivation, conflict, so you can make sure that you know what's motivating your character. And put in the stakes. If your character can't achieve their goal, what will happen? And what's your main character's misbelief, the lie that they believe? What's holding them back from being able from achieving their goal right now? This is something internal that they have a good reason to believe. Something from their past has reinforced it for them, and it's true. And we will show that in the backstory about why your character is reasonably thinking this misbelief and they can't just easily change their mind. And then you need to figure out what steps your character will need to go through to confront this misbelief, battle back and forth against their own baggage, and learn and grow and become a changed person as a result. I recommend the writing craft book, Story Genius by Lisa Crone, as a good concept for focusing your story's plot around your character's wound, their misbelief that they must challenge and overcome, and for how to intertwine this with the external plot obstacles in the story. I also recommend joining the Women's Fiction Writers Association. WFWA is a great organization with frequent online classes for its members, plus a supportive community on Facebook and in their online meetups and groups. If you like this discussion of genre, be sure to like and subscribe and click the bell so you get notice for next week's video where I trot out women's fiction recommendations for books that I've read in the last 2 years. And stay tuned for more advice and tips and tricks on writing. And until then, happy writing!